And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Mona and Jordan, but really glad that y'all are here. Excited to talk and learn together, and let's get going.
Thank you so much, Eli, and thank you all for coming. I'm so thrilled to share this digital space with you today. I can't believe that it's finally come to, that we finally have the day that Terra Incognita NYC is out. And before I say a word or two about the project, I really want to extend a very heartfelt thank you to the amazing research team that brought about this work. Myrtle Jones, Amelia Fortunato, Ola Galal, Stephen Sullivan, and Nathan Matson. And I already saw Ola in the room, which is fantastic. All of them are the most excellent social scientists, and you should watch out for their work. And of course, my co-conspirator, Jordan Kramer, who co-steered this project so elegantly as research lead. Now, Terra Incognita is concerned with how the digital space of New York City emerged during the pandemic summer of 2020. And really, one of the most important findings is that the digital city, in fact, reinforces the physical city. What I want to say now is that this finding really rings hollow without acknowledging and reckoning with the genocide, erasure, and the forced removal of the peoples on whose land the city was built. New York City, with all its vibrancy and diversity, remains a colonial space. And it's really imperative to build mindfulness of our participation in this colonial space and to acknowledge that the city was built on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples. Committing to dismantling the violent legacies of settler colonialism also means committing to the Black Lives Matter movement and the ongoing project to tackle white privilege and systemic racism in our city, in our communities, and in our institutions. And I hope that this project, and whatever small part, can be received with such intentions and as a contribution to this commitment. Now, almost a year ago, and what I say, well, almost a year ago, a little more than a year ago, when we all went into the first lockdown here in New York City, the city was facing some of the highest infection and fatality rates in the world. Our life here rapidly changed, as did our relationship to digital platforms and infrastructures. The COVID-19 outbreak and prescribed isolation, in a very abrupt way, moved most of our social interactions online. What we found was that this move made people take deeper roots locally, connecting them more to their neighborhoods through physical presence, but also more local social interaction, albeit online. In this sense, the digital opened the door to a wider world, and yet the digital was mostly employed to deepen local communities. As this shift happened, we saw the escalated impact of well-known physical and digital issues, reliance on private infrastructure, racialized policing of public space, the digital divide, harassment disproportionately impacted communities and individuals, political polarization, and so on. These occurred along the intersecting fault lines of race, class, gender, age, religion, and sexuality. So again, the biggest revelation of TI is that the digital city, for better and worse, reinforced the physical city. The digital divide, lack of broadband access, mapped onto pandemic-specific geographies of risk and inequalities. So we saw that more affluent New York City communities were able to shelter in place, while New York City's poorer communities, themselves within majority communities of color, were not in lockdown. Instead, they continued to be outside as frontline workers and thus were disproportionately put at risk for contracting the virus. As we went into lockdown, the city went into lockdown, these existing issues of discrimination and underrepresentation were exacerbated further. At the same time, however, we saw radically scaled experiments in virtual community and public space building across the city, across communities, across practices. And this is really what the report is about, what the project is about, what the conversation today is about. And just to sort of segue into Jordan's bit, how do we study this complex makeup of this new digital physical space? And so Dr. Jordan Kramer will tell you a little bit, just briefly, about what it means to do digital ethnography and also about our 5 borrow sites. Jordan.
Hi, and thank you so much, Eli and Mona. This project was really exciting to be involved in. So as Eli mentioned, I'm an anthropologist and a digital ethnographer, and I've studied urban space and emerging media through anthropological methods. So what I want to tell you about is sort of I'm going to discuss our methods and our sites. I'm actually going to tell you a little bit about the method first. And so we really wanted to understand the firsthand experiences of different communities across NYC. We drew on digital ethnography, which is a method grounded in the anthropology of digital life. This includes direct observation, in-depth interviewing, and content analysis online. And we brought on the 5 researchers, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them that Mona mentioned, to identify and then sort of zoom in on field sites in each of the 5 boroughs. And we were really lucky to be able to build on their ties to communities, to many of these communities. So I want to just briefly introduce the team, which included Amelia Fortunato, a doctoral student in sociology at the CUNY Grad Center for Staten Island. Ola Galal, a PhD candidate in anthropology also at CUNY for Brooklyn. Myrtle Jones, a doctoral student in anthropology at Columbia Teachers College for the Bronx. Dr. Nathan Madsen, a new minted anthropology PhD, so congrats Nathan, and human rights lawyer for Queens. And Stephen Sullivan, an anthropology PhD candidate at Northwestern, who's currently a Mellon Fellow at the School for Advanced Research for Manhattan. So within each borough, we identified social practices such as worship, performing, gaming, exercising, caring that were taking place online. And our researchers spent 2 months in these different field sites with different groups of people attending Zoom Shabbat services, yoga classes and game nights, hanging out in neighborhood Facebook groups in Staten Island, Brooklyn mutual aid groups, or joining Pokemon players on Discord. So within each borough, they focused on we sort of identified 3 sites within each borough. These included in Manhattan, a weekly poetry open mic event at a Latinx performing arts venue that had moved to Zoom, a yoga studio, also on Zoom, and a Pokemon Go group who used to meet in Manhattan parks and now was communicating regularly over Discord, the chat platform. In Brooklyn, running clubs organized mainly on Facebook, but also Instagram, and they hosted virtual runs. They also interacted on Instagram and the fitness route app Strava. Also mutual aid groups, mainly on Facebook, and the Brooklyn Public Library, which hosted, the library branch is all closed, but they hosted virtual events like virtual story time. Then in Queens, we had a Reform synagogue, which had services over Zoom, a cultural center, which offered arts programming, mainly on their website, but also over Zoom and Facebook. And lastly, an LGBT network, which moved events that had been, such as a drag game night that had been taking place in a bar, and they moved that to Zoom. And then in the Bronx, 2 Pentecostal churches that serve different constituencies, and which stream services over YouTube and Facebook Live, a senior arts center program that teaches seniors digital art production. And they also moved classes first to online sort of phone conferencing and then to Zoom, because they had to teach seniors how to use Zoom in many cases. And then a group of independent businesses in the Bronx, and they had webinars, Instagram live shows, and even events on the streaming platform Twitch. Then finally on Staten Island, we had the Lgbt Council, and these are all going to be pseudonyms that they'll be using, but the Lgbt Council, which had to move programming to multiple platforms, including Zoom, Discord, Facebook Live, Meetup, etc. A group of overlapping neighborhood discussion groups on Facebook that were managed by a small team of moderators. And finally, a walking tour meetup that started streaming their walking tours live over Facebook and Zoom. So those are our, so those are our sites. I'm going to pass it back to you, Mona.
Thank you so much, Jordan, for providing the sort of the fields information on the field size and sort of the backdrop of data that we were able to collect with the team. So I just want to wrap this real quick and say what kind of really emerged from this study were kind of 9 elements that make up New York City's digital public space that kind of almost function like a glue in different kinds of ways: curation, membership, publicness, safety, locality, affordances, infrastructure, intimacy, and temporality. We're only going to sort of talk about 3 of those today, but I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what they mean. So curation refers to the targeted programming and design of online events that people engaged in. Folks were very focused on achieving a sense of normalcy. What was also important for curation was moderation, which essentially meant directing and controlling the flow of activity and interaction in the digital space, which you can actually observe just now with Team New Public doing an excellent job with that. Membership refers to implicit and explicit rules about who could come in. It had a lot to do with identity, with both individual and group identity, and it also served as a platform for constituting a sense of belonging to a particular community or neighborhood. Publicness essentially refers to a sense of being in public. We all know what that means in a physical public space, but things are a little different in digital public space. Platforms essentially often confounded boundaries of public and private, which could raise really new questions of politics, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Safety referred to feeling safe, and that really was a necessary condition for digital public spaces to emerge. It was connected to feeling welcome, to belonging, but its nature was continually changing, and it also had a lot to do with the, as time and events unfolded here in the city. People also talked about physical safety a lot, especially in the context of being at risk of contracting the virus. Locality is something that refers to the heightened significance of the actual place people were in, and I just pointed to that earlier. Daily connections became denser and localized, while at the same time expanded geographically. So events and social spaces online allowed people not in New York to participate remotely, causing digital public spaces to become comprised of multiple geographic connections. Affordances refers to the technologies people or how technologies afforded people new ways and possibilities for connecting and expressing themselves, but at the same time, how they created new barriers to participation, which was a dynamic that played out and was treated very differently across communities. Infrastructure refers to the very uneven distribution of infrastructure and maintenance across the city, which really came to the fore in the lockdown, which essentially meant that vulnerabilities of technical infrastructure became social vulnerabilities, but it also had a lot to do with practice of maintenance and care. And again, we're gonna touch on that a little later. Intimacy refers to digital platforms and services providing social and economic lifelines for New Yorkers. Technologies brought many public events and activities into people's homes, and platforms and interfaces could forge intimacy. In some instances, though, often really dependent on the context at hand, and people became very sort of good at managing that. And lastly, temporality really refers to the shifting experience of time that people experience. The pandemic itself was very often narrated in temporally specific ways, such as very distinct points in a timeline. And I just did that earlier when I opened my part of the event and spoke, the day we went into lockdown or the week we went into lockdown. So this continued to happen. It still happens. And those were very specific, again, to the city. At the same time, digital interactions were also framed according to the binary of synchronous and asynchronous. And that's really something that I also encounter in teaching until this day. I'm going to leave it at that. This is just sort of a little teaser, and I'm going to hand it back to Eli. And I really look forward to the conversation. Thank you so much.
All right. Yeah, this is exciting. And if you're curious about more on those themes, as well as just everything else to dive into in the report, it's up on the website, newpublic.org/Terra Incognita. So now it's my honor and pleasure to welcome up our panelists. And we have a great group. I'm just going to very briefly introduce them and then ask each of them to just say a little hello and a little more introduction. So we have Garnett Cadogan, who is an essayist and urban thinker. We have John Paul Farmer, who is the CTO of New York City. We have Miriam Mohit, who is the research lead at Nextdoor, and Monique Tate, who's a brilliant community-driven tech activist and organizer at Community Tech New York. So I'm just going to ask each of you to say hello in that order. Garnett, do you want to go first?
Yes, hi everyone, I'm Garnett, and Eli said it all. I'm an essayist interested in the perils and the promises of the city, and particularly how public space works, whether it be online or, as we now say, IRL.
Great. John.
Hi, folks. I want to start with a big thank you to Mona and Jordan and Eli and Neil. Everyone who's put the work in to bring us together today. As you heard, my name is John Paul Farmer. I'm the Chief Technology Officer of New York City. I work for the mayor, but ultimately I work for 8.6 million people, some of whom are here today. And we do four things. The amazing team that I get to work with every day works on four things. Number one, universal broadband. Number two, digital services online to make sure we're reaching people where they are with what they need. Number three, inclusive innovation, making sure that we're working with communities to understand their needs and the role that technology and innovation can play in improving their lives. And then number four, emerging technology, policy and future planning, really looking ahead at how we can improve our city in the future. So those are the things that I do now. And I come to this work after a number of years working in the civic tech community here in New York City, primarily during my time at Microsoft. And before that in the Obama White House, where I worked on improving government through tech and innovation. I'm excited to be here and to have this conversation.
Awesome. Miriam.
Hello. Thank you for having me here with all of you. As Eli said, I'm a research lead at Nextdoor. For those of you who don't know Nextdoor, we're an app and a platform where people can plug into the neighborhoods that matter to them so they can get information, give and get help, and build connections with other people who live nearby. I've been at Nextdoor for a little over 6 years, part of the time in product management, and more recently, in more recent years as a researcher. And I love research. I just love it. And I'm really thrilled to be here with Jordan and Mona, who also are researchers. Prior to that, I was at Amazon for quite a while as the VP of site development, responsible for the online customer experience there. And though I live in San Francisco, I am also an emeritus New Yorker. I lived in Manhattan for 7 years in the late 80s and early 90s at the dawn of time and started my career there. And I still have many familial and emotional connections to New York.
Awesome. And Monique.
Hello, everyone. And I also, too, thank you for the invitation and all the amazing work that's been done. I really like how you put that, Miriam, that you are emeritus to New York. I feel that as well because I spent all of my formative years in New York City and Brooklyn and the Bedford-Stuyvesant and Brownsville neighborhoods. However, I am coming in with a couple of flavors, born and raised on the East Coast, but then migrated to the wonderful Detroit. And that's really where I got my feet wet in working in technology. I was previously with the auto industry, and then came the recession and me entering into a new career path, which has been really amazing, wonderful, and extremely revealing. I began engagement in community technology with LA Media and grew up through the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition and working with them through the Digital Stewards Program and becoming introduced into how we share technology from a community perspective, and then elevated over to the Equitable Internet Initiative, which we began in 2016. And that's where we're teaching the community how to build their own Wi-Fi and make those wireless community connections and just begin that world of exploration there. And I'm very excited to say that I, as of next month, which is of course just a couple of days away, will be the Director for Partnership and Engagement with the magnificent Community Technology New York group. And I'm very excited with the work that we're doing all around the state of New York, I should say, as well as other parts of the country. So engaging in wireless technology and teaching the community really not only to value the importance of it, but how literally to become involved, to become an owner, to solve your own problems. So I'm really excited about what we're doing. And I'll just leave this with this last couple of pieces about Community Tech New York. One of the main things that we believe in is building community networks, because that builds community power. So thank you for the invitation.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to get into it. So what we've done, Mona and I kind of decided to pick 3 of the themes that are in this report. And one of the really lovely things about being part of the research process was that there were so many kind of evocative little moments and vignettes and stories that helped us understand, what was going on for people in these different communities. And so what we thought was we would take kind of 3 of these themes, start by just sort of describing a particular place that's kind of evocative of that theme, and then we'll have a little bit of a conversation about them. And as questions come to you out there in Zoom land, please put them in the chat. We'll try to bring your voices in as well, and we can all kind of have a conversation together. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Mona to kick us off on Locality with the Poetry Cafe.
That's actually Jordan's cue.
Oh, sorry. I'm going to hand it over.
No problem.
Thank you, Eli. So I'm going to start us off with some sort of moments from this poetry open mic. So in many of our sites, daily connections became sort of denser and more localized, even though online events were actually more accessible to sort of, geographically distant participants. So at the open mic night, which had been originally hosted at a performing arts venue in Manhattan, but the actual space of the cafe and its location in New York City remained really important to the poets and other attendees. And so one of the weekly themes, for example, was based on the phrase, "what had happened was," as a sort of thing New Yorkers say. And at one point, one of the performers' phone froze, and the host sort of jokingly interjected, "what had happened was the phone changed." So referencing New York's sort of specific phrases like this really located Zoom events in the space of the city. So even though we've talked a little bit about the digital versus the physical city, right, they're really interlaced. It also became a new tradition for the host to ask new performers if they'd actually been to the actual venue, right? So the events were full of these references back to the original space. And one night the host asked a new performer, "I have to ask you, since you live in New York City, even though you're not currently there, have you ever been to," and he referred to the actual space. And because she had, everybody starts cheering and clapping, posting in the chat, "she passed." And here, this is one of the things I find interesting as a sort of anthropologist, is that here meant both the space of the event on Zoom and the actual original venue. Even though many of the participants were either no longer in New York, or people from sort of all over were able to join. So that's my first vignette.
Great. So I wanted to use that as a jumping off point to ask our respondents, how you think digital technologies have changed what being local means, and what's the value of localness in a world where ostensibly we can connect wherever we want. Miriam.
Well, I guess 2 things come to mind about that. So, Mona, before you talked in this vignette describes how being local, you can be inhabiting the same space when you're actually physically incredibly distant from each other. But I also think that one way that digital technology has changed what it means to be local is that you can asynchronously participate in events that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to participate in. So you can stay in the know about what's going on in your neighborhood without having to show up at the community meeting that it is a certain time in a certain place that you may not be able to get to. And so I think that digital technology has, while of course we have lots and lots of issues about access to technology and capability with technology, it has allowed people to participate in local conversations that they may not have even known were happening and that they couldn't have gotten to otherwise because they could do it on their own time. It kind of goes along with this whole theme that's not just for neighborhood platforms, but the whole idea of streaming media for like when you want to see it and doing things on on your time, essentially. An example in my own neighborhood in San Francisco is how we keep safe in the neighborhood. So in my neighborhood, we've had a 370% increase in burglary during the pandemic. And one of the neighbors on Nextdoor posted information about how to secure your garage, like how to kind of take security precautions in your house. And then neighbors got together on the digital platform to share information and to come together and to set up a meeting with our local police precinct to talk about, what's going on in the neighborhood. Now, if without these digital tools and the ability to have that asynchronous conversation, none of that could have happened. So that's just one example. I could give more, but I want to give other people time.
I'll join in on responding to that because for me, as far as defining what local is, it's global. Local is no longer really 100% local. Local is global, but another word that I associate with it is, or a few words I associate with that are empathy and understanding, because it really gives us an opportunity to see our neighbors from a global perspective and broaden our engagement. And we can even establish personal relationships with other people if we so choose to do that. But before we lived in silos, so to speak, and more of a communication and connection with those who were similar to and like us. We have the opportunity for those of us who can access and have access and go online to see the world in a whole new perspective and make new friends and relationships and take on causes and challenges that we may not have previously engaged with. There is only one thing that I am pleased about from the pandemic, nothing relevant to it as itself, but the one thing I'm pleased about is that it truly unveiled the disparity about internet access and about digital literacy and about all of the implications that does to us as humans. Because when you think about that there are 18 million people who don't have a broadband connection and don't have smartphones either. And they cross the gamut, of course, of rural and urban, but 14 million of the 18 million are in urban areas. So it's really revealed that, and in that, there has been a response from every perspective and at least an awareness so that at a state level, they will become more engaged. Federal is already showing their engagement, and local municipalities and communities are showing their engagement. So as we increase this, we can then increase our community. And I too then will stop at that point to leave way to someone else.
If I can build on Monique's point, because it's so important, is that first and foremost, we have to recognize that in 2021 and beyond, a person cannot fully participate in society without being connected. And here in New York City, we had done the work just before the pandemic hit to develop an internet master plan that showed exactly what these disparities looked like, showed that over 1 million New Yorkers were disconnected, did not have mobile or home broadband. Even more were underconnected. They had only one, but not the other. Generally, this was an affordability issue more than anything else. And that meant that this was an issue that affected communities that were lower income, communities of color more than others. This is a serious equity issue that has been made crystal clear to everybody by the pandemic. Now, we've had a lot of progress made by the pandemic as well. Outreach to students, to older adults, to others, but there's a lot more work to do, because you look at what this means for education, for access to healthcare, for access to social experiences with friends, with family, mental health issues here. There's just so much related to being connected. and we've got our work cut out for us. Fortunately, we're doing a lot of work here in New York City. If anybody here is focused on connectivity, please respond to the RFP that's currently open. Go to nyc.gov/CTO. We've got $157 million to spend. We've got 100,000 city-controlled assets that we're putting on the table. This is a priority for my office, for the city, and we want to make sure that we improve upon the state because we recognize it can't continue. So building on top of that Monique laid out so clearly, I do think that there is a bit of an issue here in that social connections matter so much in terms of discoverability online. When you live in a physical neighborhood, you can experience something, discover something new that frankly no one had introduced you. You weren't already in touch with them. You didn't follow the right people on social media. You'd never been in this world before, and you can discover something. But so often, I think Nextdoor is maybe a good example of an exception to this, but so often the online experiences are really, in some ways, algorithmically reinforced around your prior experiences, your prior connections, and it makes it hard to discover new experiences. So I think that's one thing that I'm thinking a lot about and thinking about how we address this, not just during the pandemic, but in the years ahead.
Great. Let me just, we're going to get to some more questions. Our next theme is infrastructure. So I want to save some of our, I feel like we can go deep on infrastructure shortly, but just to hang on this locality question for 1 minute, to me, it was really interesting provocation to think like, there's something about the character and depth and kind of like uniqueness of local spaces that does some things for digital spaces that you can't get to any other way. Like that the Poetry Cafe had a kind of quality to it that if you were starting from scratch in a digital space, you wouldn't be bringing those qualities. I'm just wondering if anyone can expand on that or comment on what does drawing on localness give to a digital space?
There's this idea that sociologist Ray Oldenburg has, he calls it third places, in which the first place is home, second place is work, third place is, these places of encounter and exchange, or encounter each other, exchange ideas, build community, build relationships, and they're absolutely crucial to develop and building community. Barbershops, bars, churches, parks, waterfronts, fast food restaurants. So for example, research like, McDonald's, for example, is almost like the equivalent of the English pub, which by the way meant, it's for public, places in which people are, in a low income, people come, sit, build community, exchange ideas, gift each other, with their presence, have a sense of attachment to the neighborhood. And, more and more, there's this, other phenomenon, existing alongside that they call interlocal. I heard the term first from Socio-Technical Literacy, the urbanist, where people are not so much identifying with New York City and Mexico City, he found, as much as they're, identifying with this particular neighborhood in Pueblo and a particular neighborhood in New York City. So you'll find that, if you go to Sunset Park, there are quite a few people in Sunset Park from the same neighborhood in Pueblo, and who move and transition in between both of them, in which they see themselves as deeply committed to the local, but the local in two different places. And so the way they use online spaces, when they come to these online spaces, they're bringing the sense of either being interlocal, or in this third space, in which, as for example, you're in a pandemic and you're losing the places you can congregate together, you can build community, you can exchange ideas, jokes, plans. That these places have become places of gathering, places of organization, places of encounter, rich exchange, which are building from what existed before in these local environments. And also you have ways of actually being interlocal, which you couldn't because of travel, being reduced or stopped altogether. And so the digital space became a place in which it could be interlocal. The digital space became one in which, certainly a shadow of the ones that we have in real life in public space, but still real nonetheless, and drawing on the riches of building on and anchoring itself in the existence of these actual local public spaces that exist before. So in other words, the richness of these online third spaces, or the richness of these interlocal spaces digitally, we're all drawing on the wealth of these spaces and the sense of locality that existed before we entered that digital realm.
Miriam, let's go quickly to you, and then we'll jump into our infrastructure vignette.
Yeah, thanks. I was just thinking about what Monique was saying about the local is global. And I think that at the same time that the pandemic showed us how small and flat the world is, to use the Thomas Friedman, or I think that was his book about the flat world. At the same time, we saw people really tuning in to their local neighborhoods where they were confined, and their pride of place was showing, where so many things felt far away and imaginary and out of control. And your local neighborhood, that tangible space, was where you could have some positive impact and some control over your life. And so, like, real ways that we would see this at Nextdoor was like, is the cafe that you love about to go out of business? And can you start a GoFundMe for them on the platform? Or do you want to lobby your city to create a slow street in your neighborhood because you're confined to your apartment and you need to get outside and walk with your kids? Or is there someone right nearby who can help me? And I can look on the help map to see if there's someone nearby who can help me. Or even something like, is there someone posting that, there's a local store that just got a shipment of toilet paper when everybody was hoarding toilet paper, and oh, now I'm going to run over there or ask a neighbor to go over there and get it. So I think at the same time, there was these two levels going on with the local is global. We're all impacted by this pandemic. At the same time, really focusing on the local and then sharing information where you can have a tangible, positive impact. So those are two things that we really saw during this time.
Awesome. All right, to infrastructure and the synagogue.
Yeah, thanks. So I want to move us to Queens, where we studied the community building and the digital space of a synagogue, as Eli said. And I want to kind of, with this vignette, move us on a little bit from the idea of infrastructure as purely sort of the cables on the ground, which of course is important, but sort of to other forms of infrastructure that also very much connect to practices of maintenance and care. And so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to read you a quote, because I think, the people in these spaces tell their own story the best. And this is a quote from the rabbi. And he said, "We've been having some people go to people's homes in a safe manner as we can to install a webcam. We recognize there are people who don't necessarily want to come to Shabbat services, but they might want to come to high holiday services. So that's why we added very explicit language to say, we will try to help you. I bought a bunch of webcams. We have a fair number of senior members, people in their late 80s and into their 90s who are regulars at our services. Slowly, we've been able to get some of them online with a Zoom camera, which is always wonderful. They are there with their faces and they can see us. We can see them. And we know what a huge advantage that is." And so I just want to leave it at that and hope that the conversation about infrastructure kind of points us into that direction a little bit. And then I'm very happy to talk a little bit more about how the space then actually unfolded and sort of was comprised of these, different kinds of community members that came in with different digital literacies, as Monique also so eloquently pointed to earlier.
Awesome. Can you just, Mona, do you want to just tell us like 1 minute more on what people were participating in, what the service was like?
Yeah, sure. So the service was on Zoom. And what was really interesting about that was that they are similar to this space, actually. For example, there was a very eloquent use of background. So the rabbi would, for example, have the image of the actual temple in the background sometimes, and then in prayer it would be a background of the Torah, or there was a very specific use also of the chat. We're doing that now as well, and Nilam is kind of curating that very well, but the chat, as opposed to the chat in the Poet Cafe, was a very formal space where there were formal announcements made, such as, what was going to happen next, who's going to get married, important information. So it was kind of almost like a whiteboard, where things were pinned. Similarly, there was a very embodied experience of the digital space, with standing up for prayer and singing together. And also a very interesting, and this is a wonderful anecdote that you should read in the report, at the end, an opening up of everybody was unmuted and people could say, "Hi, it's so good to see you." And people were really talking over one another. And that was very interesting, a very early on concern of the rabbi to kind of get on top of that initially and sort of curate that in a certain way. And so as you can see, sort of the infrastructure building from and with a community, it was so much more than cables on the ground. It was really very much a practice of care. And so I think we cannot really think infrastructure without that. And I really hope that is something we can take on as we move out of the pandemic and, really elevate and work with organizations such as Monique's to, get that on the ground.
Great. So let me ask, one of the things that vignette brings to mind for me is this conversation that we were having from the previous section about kind of inequity and what it takes to show up in digital locality, that not everybody has access to that. And that also came to the fore for me in another vignette that just stuck with me from the report, which was, just the way that being on camera shaped how people kind of felt about presenting their socioeconomic, all of a sudden my room and my space is coming with me into a conversation with other people. And I've got to consider when I'm showing up at the yoga studio or whatever, what that reflects about me, how I identify in public. And so we had a question in the chat from Sandra about how digital spaces have promoted equity, how they can promote equity. And I'm just curious, I'd love to hear folks reflect on that question. And I know this is very close to many of your work.
I'm happy to chime in first. I'll start by saying, to build on Mona's description of digital infrastructure. In my mind, digital infrastructure breaks down further into three different types. There's physical digital infrastructure. We've got to have conduit and fiber that allows all this to take place. We've got the technical digital infrastructure. Here we're talking about the code and the data that allows a platform, an online space to exist. And then there's the social digital infrastructure. People have to know what to do with it. And what the mores and rules are, even the unwritten rules around it. I think what you just brought up, though, is a really interesting, maybe additional, it's kind of what the user brings and what the costs associated with participating are. It's not just being able to afford broadband. It's not just being able to afford a laptop. There are then these social pressures about, do you have the right lighting, and should you go invest in a better light? And you can tell my lighting right now is not great. But those are the kinds of things that people start thinking about, and there are these pressures. And do people actually choose not to participate in certain spaces because they don't feel comfortable, because they don't feel like what they present measures up? I think that's a really, really interesting question that I'm going to add and take away from this myself.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but that also relates to what are the different technologies and different platforms create different areas of equity and inequity, right? So if you have a video-based platform, which is like Zoom, then you have the question of, do you have a background? Do you not have a background? The lighting, all the things that you just mentioned. If you have a text-based platform, then it's about, how are your typing skills? How are your visual skills? Is your facility with the language in which you're supposed to be typing? I think it really depends on the technology platform in what ways equity is enhanced or decreased. So for example, I remember talking to a guy in a research study I was doing who was a lead on Nextdoor, and it only came out quite far into the interview that he had a pretty severe physical disability where he would not be able to really leave his house for much of anything. This was before the pandemic. But he could type on Nextdoor and he was very articulate. And so he could participate in the community in ways that he couldn't in the physical world. Now, that was good for him with his particular situation. And so it created more equity for him. But maybe someone who doesn't type English well, it creates less equity for them. So I really think it just depends on each platform specifically.
What I'll add to that is that with the areas that I've been working with in both the Detroit Community Technology Project and with Community Technology New York, for us, infrastructure, local infrastructure is super important because we really focus on community connection. So we've actually had the opportunity to bring light to those places that have existed for a long time. People always talk about how an underground network exists, and it really does. And an underground network births so many things. Think about hip hop, think about other things that these underground networks really birth. The same thing is happening in technology and with the local community infrastructure, bringing the local organizations, small gathering spaces, or even churches and larger spaces like that into the forefront of being a center of where people are coming and connecting together, whether it's to learn about technology, access technology, and even more importantly, access the internet. Because of that lack of access, people have been accustomed to pulling up in a car, if they had one, and jumping onto the internet at the library, at the church, because it's close enough for them to share out. Or some of the other maker spaces that exist in the varying communities, and they have been trying to publicize that they are helping people to build a computer or build a bicycle or various other, or get into art, music, poetry, any of the other forms of sharing. And so there is a very close relationship to what the infrastructure and technology and the ability to engage in those places and how it's brought light to them and an opportunity for people to still come together. Some of the various venues that we barely even knew about, they have been hosting open mic, and people can just still socially distance because the spaces are big enough. They're like warehouse type spacing, and providing an opportunity for people to just come together. You really can't build on connection without engaging in the community and bringing them on board and participating. So it's extremely important.
Yeah. I see that one of our researchers, Ola, is on, and I don't want to put you on the spot, Ola, but I was just curious if you had any thoughts on this front.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I agree with all the comments that have been very insightful comments that have been said so far. And one example that comes to mind to kind of reinforce that point is the mutual aid groups, specifically in relation to the idea of hyper locality and different forms of equity and inequity that were revealed in this experience, is that obviously the fact that some of these mutual aid groups were actually known by some of the residents, but also some of the residents did not know about their existence. People who did not have access to the internet or were not used to using the internet in their daily activities were not aware of the use of mutual aid groups. So one of the ideas that came up in one of these forums is that they should print posters about these mutual aid groups and stick them on buildings or in churches to kind of connect the digital city to the physical city, because obviously some of the exclusivity of the digital space reinforces already existing inequities. So this was one idea that I thought was brilliant, and that kind of tried to address that digital divide and the inequities that are reproduced by the shift to online.
Great.
Oh,
go ahead.
In Ola speak, one thing that also occurs to me in terms of thinking of infrastructure is to also consider infrastructure as part of a network of care. What does the infrastructure of care look like, and to recognize that so much of it, particularly thinking of mutual aid societies, think of a group like Moms for Housing in Oakland and parallel groups that across the nation, depends a lot on structures of kinship, structures of intimacy, and so much about digital life. It's for the people who have these infrastructures of care and mutual aid societies. It feels like a lot of the agency particularly issues related to the privacy, issues of control of information and the platforms is removed from that realm of intimacy and kinship and agency and control. And so that's also a different way of thinking about the inequality in terms of agency, in the way inequality cuts across important structures, structures of care, structures of agency, rooted in ideas of kinship and structures of intimacy. And so that's another way in thinking about what actually happens with technology, with working online, and how it raises important challenges that we have to wrestle with in thinking about infrastructure.
There's so much more I'd love to explore on each of these, but I'm going to push us forward because I want to make sure we get to our third theme. So let us move to the final vignette that we have here on membership.
Hey, so finally, I want to bring you to one of our field sites on Staten Island. And one of the areas that we focused on there were neighborhood Facebook groups on Staten Island, which were Staten Island wide. And I think that the smaller population there and the kind of boundedness of the space made this a little more possible. And some of these groups existed before the pandemic, but anyone living in Staten Island could join them. They were really seen as sort of spaces for residents and neighbors, but they often became quite contentious sites of debate over politics and acceptable public speech. So during the pandemic, some of these debates led some people to create offshoot groups, which were allowed to be sort of explicitly political, both right and left-leaning groups. And the line between moderating and censoring was sort of frequently policed and debated, both by members and moderators and administrators. So for these, and each group had like a very small team of moderators and administrators responsible for kind of managing the space. And so the moderators often felt that enforcing the rules for each group was really necessary to maintain this functioning public space online. As one moderator put it, quote, "What some people would call censorship, I would call administrating." In the largest of these groups, political posts were completely banned. And political was supposed to mean sort of not partisan, that is not specifically about electoral politics. But political often actually in practice meant anything contentious, oppositional views, particularly other people's views that you don't agree with. So one member, for example, who often posted pro-Trump memes, got very excited about a food-based post and said, "Holy bleep, a non-political post." Whereas one of the group moderators considered pro-police and Blue Lives Matters posts very political and wanted to ban those. And then she relented after Black Lives Matter posts were permitted, saying that it's just very hard to have that conversation. So it was really interesting to see what politics came to mean and how it's often used again as a way of legitimating sort of certain kinds of public speech or policing kind of what can be said in public. But I should add that people also saw these spaces in other ways as private. So again, we saw a lot of this tension where ideas about public and private were being reworked constantly.
Great, so there's a lot there. Let's start. I mean, I'm interested, I would say many things in online space are political. So this whole project of trying to remove politics is kind of, what does that even mean? But I'm curious if we get behind that to like, why do we think, what do we think people mean by that or are wanting from that? Or because it did come up a lot, right? That this question of like, how do we create a non-political space? I'm curious if anyone. Yeah.
I'm happy to jump in. This is a really, really interesting topic, and I'm not surprised, but I'm really glad that it came up in the Terra Incognita research. So I have heard as well, what you just said, Jordan, about political means something I don't agree with. When people say, I don't want it to be political, it often means something that I don't agree with. And I'll harken back to what John Paul said earlier, where with Nextdoor, we're not we're a place for everyone in the neighborhood. And so by definition, you're going to find people who you don't agree with. Even if your neighborhood is really homogeneous in some ways, you're going to encounter people who you don't agree with. And this is a big challenge for us. We work on this all the time. We don't have all the answers, but it's something we think about a lot and we struggle with because we're not about filter bubbles and echo chambers, which means we are about facilitating those kinds of conversations that may be uncomfortable. And some of the things that we've found that can help with that are making sure that people's humanity is really brought forth in the digital realm, which can be really hard, right? If talking behind a name that is not a real name, they don't have a picture, then that's dehumanizing. At the same time, if someone comes out with a picture or a name, that can make them feel vulnerable. So there's a lot of things that have to be threaded, in this area of what is political and what do people want. What we hear a lot is that people, I shouldn't even say people, because people are all different from each other, right? But this idea of how do people have a conversation and start to engage in something where they don't actually agree. It's easy to say, oh, if everyone is just civil and nice, they'll agree. But sometimes they really don't agree. And so we work a lot on trying to, what we call, this is based on research that comes out of Stanford, but the idea of getting people to stop and take a moment, take a pause before they engage in an online, in the fray, and get so worked up about stuff. And so I always think in really tangible forms. What can you actually do with technology to impact people's behavior online? So one thing that we did we call it a kindness reminder, that if our machine learning detects language in a comment or a post that is likely to be inflammatory, we pop something up that's basically just reminds people to take a breath, stop. Remember, these are your neighbors, these are people, be kind to each other. And it seems like such a tiny thing, but it actually makes a difference. So I guess I'm just saying that this idea of what is political and how people engage with that, which can be sometimes really aggressive and hostile, I really encourage everyone to think about how technology can bring humanity into the interactions.
So I want to just push on that a little bit and Monica, I want to bring you in as well, but there are ways in which I think sometimes when we imagine digital spaces, we imagine them as like less power stratified than other kinds of spaces. And I think like one of the interesting things about looking at this kind of the membership part of the report was looking at how power shows up in terms of who can speak and who cannot, and what is okay here and what it's not. And so, John, when we were discussing this beforehand, you had kind of some thoughts on the difference between the roles people take on in a physical meeting and the roles people take on in digital space. And I just wondered if you wanted to share that, and then Monique, let's come to you.
Certainly, I think that's very true, is that we behave differently when we're in person looking at someone physically present than when it's all behind a screen or often behind a keyboard and you're not even seeing a person. You might see an avatar and you don't know who you're responding to, and you might respond in a way that you simply wouldn't do face to face. Or we're wired in a way where human beings generally avoid conflict when they're together. Think about when you're in a public park. How many fights do you see breaking out in a public park? It's pretty rare. I mean, it can happen, but it's pretty rare. And then you go onto social media, and everywhere you look, there is kind of vitriol flying back and forth. And so I think in a lot of ways, these are not places where there's a role for government to step in, but these are conversations where those of us in society, especially the private owners of these platforms that are being treated as public spaces, need to think long and hard about the rules they should put in place and the ways that they can, even if it's not a rule, where they can make interventions that can lower the temperature and get people to actually treat each other civilly. And I know that you don't want people to say civil in terms of then don't stand up for what's right. That's not what it means. But to be able to disagree without being disagreeable, to be able to debate an issue without attacking a person, I think is a really important next step that we need to take in terms of our digital spaces.
Monique, did you want to?
Yes, just a quick comment. I really love and wrote down to just repeat. I love the statement that that you made, Mona, about just straight hard to have that conversation because there are a lot of things that are straight hard to have that conversation, but we will never get to a place of healing unless we really approach the conversation and the elephant in the room one bite at a time. There's a quote from a favorite person of mine, Brian Stevenson, who is the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. And one of the things that he said was, how do we look at our unjust past for a just future? And you can't unless you recognize that conversations are going to be hard. Just think about your personal conversations in your families and the things that you go through. Think about your relationships, with whomever they be, your partners or your spouses. And those that are long lasting, they reflect that there is some genuineness in there, and people have the ability to say, I'm sorry, I apologize for this, and then identify where they are able to make changes and then go forward, because you'll never get to that space of healing unless we literally do address them. And one of the biggest challenges of the United States in particular is racism. Now, racism for some is going to be a monopoly, and for others, it's misery. So how do you join that kind of thing together? And it's only through having the difficult conversations. What I don't like about that, and John said it very well, what I don't like about the internet in some ways is that people have the ability to hide. And because they have the ability to hide, then they will not even try to approach the conversation from a perspective of healing, but they really approach it from a perspective of hatred, of name calling. And we also have to recognize that because of, and Mona, I think you mentioned this, because of the algorithms that are set up in the computer intentionally, we're being fed different kinds of information just based on where we go. And we have to recognize that that's occurring also. So you are sometimes being fed information that's just going to continue to keep you in an insightful place, and when I say insightful, I don't mean digging in, I mean to incite a situation and bring negativity towards it. So I love exploring this, and I think that we really have to be realistic, and we can't, if we truly want healing, we can't say that we want to be homogeneous and only living in a silo and connecting with those that are just like us. We have to because the world is not just like us. And as I said, local is global. So we have to embrace in a much larger perspective.
All right. Mona, if you have something really quick, and then we're going to go to our lightning round, and then we'll get final audience questions in.
No, I was just gonna second all of that, but also say that I think it's really important, and this has come out of our conversations from early on, Eli, is we need to talk about whiteness here and how designs, whether those are public space designs and or technological designs, normalize white privilege and how that sort of gets baked into our social practices as we sort of move into this digital physical city. And that has a lot to do with what we optimize for algorithmically, for example, as well. And that's a whole additional conversation to be had. But and I know Jordan has thoughts on that too, but I just wanted to put that out there, and I'm going to lower my hand and we can move on.
Totally agree. Yeah. All right, well, let's move to lightning round. So I'm going to ask each panelist to pick something digital from the pandemic and say whether they want to abandon it or keep a version of it as we move into a post-pandemic future. Garnet, what would you either abandon or keep?
I'd keep Versus.
Versus?
Yes. These online encounters are sometimes clashes between different musicians that brings together a whole host of communities, and you see it with icons that often you'd never be able to afford to see, and them coming together. So let's take the Jamaican example that builds on locality, infrastructure, and membership. Being a Man versus Bounty Killer. People in the audience who are dancehall fans know exactly who I'm speaking about. Two people that you often would never be able to pay to see. You'd have to actually head back to Kingston or maybe Queens in the right time to see them. And they're both there these online parties with huge local diasporic audiences from all over celebrating and getting together and becoming an online party space and in a space of encounter, space of healing, space of joy, a space of humor. Yeah, I hope that it never stops and it emerged during the pandemic, and I hope that it's something that continues well past the pandemic.
Nice. John, what would you keep or just...
I would both keep and drop remote work. I think that we lose things by not being together, but also the flexibility is pretty wonderful. And so I'd like to see much more of a hybrid approach going forward. And I think that the forced adoption of tools like what we're using right now to have this conversation has meant that we're not going to go back to the way things were. We're going to go back to some kind of hybrid approach.
Awesome. Miriam. We can't, you're muted. Oops.
I second the keep and drop remote work. At first, I was just going to keep it. Like if I had to choose keep it or go back to the way it was, I would absolutely keep remote work. I get to spend more time with my dog. I get to spend more time with my kids. I get to spend more time, in my pajamas. I really like that part of it. I would drop the lack of hugs. I would drop the lack of social dancing. I just like all of these experiences that don't have physical touch. We have so many senses. We have hearing, we have sight, we have sound. Those are all fulfilled in a digital world, but smell and touch, not so much. And I think that in terms of humanity and humanizing and creating connection between people, touch is a really important part of that. So I would drop that. And yeah, those things.
And Monique?
I would keep family and friends meetups on video conferencing, Zoom, WhatsApp, I don't care what you use, but I really appreciate that. That's really grown. People have tried to make a conscientious effort to get together with family and relatives and friends that they had been very distant from. So I would certainly keep that. I don't know that I'd have anything. I think I would just drop not being able to go out as much as I'd like.
Awesome. We have time for one or two final questions from the audience. Let me see. Actually, there was one, I'm going to try to get back to it, but about sort of privately owned public spaces that New York City and other cities have been grappling with, and how that in physical space informs the research here. And I was just wondering, Mona or Jordan, if you have any thoughts on that. The questioner asked about ownership, management, and surveillance of digital public spaces.
I have so many thoughts on that. As you know, and a lot of these themes come actually up in the Coding AI series, which is not meant as a plug, but as there's a whole additional conversation to be had about that. But I want to link this to this conversation and to what folks have said in the chat, and also what panelists have said and what we talk about a lot, which is socio-technical literacy. I think what we're seeing here is a rapid acceleration of people knowing what's going on. I think if we were to conduct a study about what people learned about how some of these technologies survey them and are actually used for oppression, you would see like a huge, growth in knowledge over that past year. So I think we've leaped forward, and I think we need to build on that. And I think that doing that in a very local way, starting at your doorstep, is very important. So there's, a ton of policymaking, for example, in activism and the cities involved, going on in New York City. If you're interested in that, get involved. And so I think, those are my thoughts. My thoughts on that without going down a rabbit hole.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank. This was a really rich conversation. Honestly, I feel like we could have gone for a lot longer and a lot deeper on all of these topics, and I hope we continue to discuss them. I want to thank Mona and Jordan for leading this research, and I'm going to hand things over to Josh, who is going to invite folks to share some thoughts in our Miro board and participate with us for a minute before we close out. Josh?
Hi, everybody. I'm going to be spotlit in a second. You can, of course, find the link to the Miro board in the chat, and I would encourage you to join us there. I'm Josh, and I'm with New Public, and if you join me in the Miro, or just follow along in Zoom, you can see all the great stuff we built for you there. So by now you've caught a few glimpses of everything that we've made, and you're free to kind of explore and engage with all the different pieces. This piece is this page is intended to be a time capsule of our digital lives this last year, and we want to invite you to help us create it. So let me take you on a quick tour. So I'm going to bring everybody to me. This board is divided into the beginning of the pandemic section, the life during the pandemic, and what might happen after the pandemic. So in the middle, there are a lot of fun, interesting things to play around with and explore. And the first one we've got is this one right here. It's the doodle and collage kind of area. So we have lots of different tools and instructions, things for you to mess around with. We have step-by-step pieces. We also have kind of like all sorts of collage tools, different colored shapes. So there are kind of already some drawings. You can kind of get an idea of what's there based on, we had a doodle hangout event last year, last week. And people kind of got a head start. But after this event ends, you'll have a chance to kind of play around and make whatever you like. So that's one thing that we have for you. You've heard a lot about our Terra Incognita research. And down here, you can see kind of a fuller exploration of some of the quotes from researchers, from the participants in the study. You can also download the report for yourself. And right in the Miro board, you can page through the PDF and get a kind of a snapshot of what it's like. So we have two more areas down here to explore. We have an audio area. And in the audio area, you can call and leave us a voicemail about some of your experiences from the last year. You can also listen to a compilation of messages that we've received already And we also have a kind of text notes area if something like poetry or flash fiction feels like more your speed or a better fit for you. Finally, we've got this third area to explore the what the future might be like. So we, of course, have some thoughts and we want to share them with you, but we also are interested in what you think might happen in the future, moving away from the pandemic. What do we bring with us? What do we leave behind, like we were just exploring in that game? In addition to, and just to be clear, we want you to leave us your questions. So what are you curious about? What do you think might be happening? We gotta luck this, okay. And here I wanna show you the future idea generator as an idea of one of the activities we've got for you. So basically you take one of each of these three categories. You could take an adjective, you could take a piece of technology, or you can take a normal everyday activity and kind of put them together and see if you can kind of create something that's fun and innovative. So for example, let's say if we take barbecuing and we take voice commands that are integrated, maybe we end up with integrating voice commands and barbecue, and we can kind of command our barbecue to roast itself, or maybe we can command some burnt ends for ourselves. So this is really fun to play around with, and just an example of the kind of things we have for you here. We hope you take plenty of time to explore and see everything that we've got for you here in this Miro board. Thanks very much. I'm going to pass it back to Neelam.
Hi, everybody. I'm not sure if I'm spotlit or just a voice of God right now, but hi, I'm Neelam. I'm your faithful chat moderator. I was just sending you all a message so you know that you can keep exploring and adding to the board after the event. We'll follow up with recordings, the board itself, and a few other fun materials that we've put together. I want to thank Mona and Jordan and our panelists and Eli for moderating. We've had a lot of fun together today. We'll be here for the next 5 minutes just playing around in the board, but of course, we want you to engage with the research. So feel free to go to newpublic.org/Terra-Incognita. That's where you can find a little bit about more of the materials that Josh laid out here on the board. We'll also be sure to update the website. And then, of course, if you'd like to keep in touch with New Public, you can sign up at newpublic.substack.com for our newsletter. We'll share more of our research projects, our community building projects, everything that we're up to there. And yeah, it was such a pleasure to have you all join us today. Thank you.